Sabrina.
Hi, Kassia.
How are you?
I'm good. I am super interested in hearing about the conversation you had.
Well, I'm going to take your mood down a notch.
Uh-oh.
Because we have a history of talking about very hard things on this podcast, and we do our damnedest to humanize those issues and make them personal and give you a real story. And today's is no different. We're talking about gender violence. That's a hard topic. But I had the privilege of talking with ElsaMarie D'Silva from India. She is a social innovator and entrepreneur, and she is responsible for launching SafeCity, which is now a global platform being used to crowd map acts of gender violence around the world.
What does that mean, crowd mapping acts of gender violence?
So it means that survivors of gender violence, 80% in this case of whom are women, go on and share their stories. And they actually detail as much as they want to or feel comfortable what happened to them and where. And then the platform actually maps that in open source data that is accessible to communities so that communities are then empowered to take action, whether that's through legislation, whether that's through urban planning, whether that's through designing different spaces to reduce violence, ultimately is the goal, of course, in their communities.
I'm curious how much of this is in collaboration with like local authorities, or maybe not at all.
So it's community specific, right? So it depends on what they want to do with the data and what action they want to take. The platform itself is about publicizing that information, making the data readily available, and actually creating the space for victims to report their stories. But it's certainly, they're now working with police departments, they're working with local authorities in different regions. It's now the foremost crowd mapping platform for gender violence in the world. And it's from this woman, ElsaMarie, who herself lived through and witnessed domestic violence.
It's so hard. I'm sure it's so hard for her to come forward and to give such intimate details about what was happening in her home. But the fact that she was able to translate that into such activism that has now impacted people around the world. And really what's frustrating about the history of domestic violence in this country, and I'm sure around the world, is that survivors are so often not believed, right? Are so often kind of criticized or shamed or cast aside. And so even the women and men who decide to go to their local authorities and report the crime, very often nothing comes of it, which makes it a deterrent for others to do that. And I'm guessing, my hope is that through ElsaMarie's platform, the community to community aspect of it really encourages people to come forward in a different way than they might have if it was just go and report to the police. Is that true?
Absolutely. And it's all done anonymously, which I think is part of what kind of changes the game and makes it a safer space and a more accessible, approachable space for women specifically to show up and share these stories. I think one of the big takeaways for me is how privileged I have been to always feel safe, to feel safe in my relationships, to feel safe where I live. And there is no question that there are things that we do differently as women that are second nature to us because of the risk of gender violence in the world, period. Like carrying my keys between my fingers if I'm alone in a parking garage, right? Like nobody taught me to do that, but I will always do that.
Yeah.
But what we talk about is the rates of gender violence in India and how high they are. And the various forms of victimization that she's experienced. And I think you were doing research for another project that showed how pervasive it is here in the States as well.
Yeah, it is. And we were talking about the incarceration system that we have here, where as many as 75% of the women who are incarcerated have a history of domestic violence. And many of them are incarcerated because of that. That it becomes criminalized.
Right. The fact that those survivors are being criminalized is mind-boggling.
Right. The idea is that if you died from domestic violence, you are a victim. But if you survived, then you're a criminal, and that is a really slippery slope to have to navigate. And frankly, it makes me sad that on ElsaMarie's platform that they have to be anonymous or that it would make people feel safer to be anonymous. I certainly understand it because of this pervasive culture of shaming and the stigmatizing of survivors. But you would hope in like an ideal society that their communities would come around them and help them and get them through it. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And we live in a world where survivors would feel much more comfortable being anonymous because they don't want to have to go through the after effects of what that culturally and societally means for them.
For sure. And I want to be really clear that, domestic violence and gender violence are not synonymous, right? Like domestic violence is often one form of gender violence, and SafeCity, this platform, is gender violence at large. And so there could be random acts of sexual assault, or is one of many things that gets reported. But both of these things, and this is something that we dive into, both of these things are indicators of gender inequity at large, right? Like higher rates of domestic violence, higher rates of gender violence are both reflections of women being less valued than men. And we absolutely dive into that today. Take a listen. ElsaMarie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kassia. My pleasure.
And for staying up so late in India on our behalf. So I want to start this conversation by reading a blurb from your personal website. It says, and I quote, "She wears many hats and has many diverse interests: social entrepreneurship, social development, peace, aviation, sugarcraft, mental health, personal development, and coaching." Now, we could dive into all of those. Some of those we will dive into. But before we go any further, I have to know, what is sugarcraft?
I always get that question, and I think it surprises people. So sugarcraft is fondant and the decorations that you make out of fondant. So, on cupcakes, on wedding cakes, etc.
How did you get into that?
When I was in college, my mom made sure that I went for all kinds of artistic courses, flower making and cake decoration, etc. And at that time, I would always wonder, why? But it was fun, so I went along with it. And subsequently, I ended up making all the decorations at my siblings' weddings, friends' weddings, and baked their cakes and for their children. And then, I got into a corporate job, and for almost 20 years, I had stopped baking because I just didn't have the time.
And you were working in aviation, is that right?
I was working in aviation. I had a long career between two of India's largest airlines. So I'd completely, disconnected with my hobbies because I was really working very long hours. And aviation is a 24/7 job. So when everybody else has a weekend, I was working. I've missed Christmas, Easter, birthdays, New Year, etc.
No time for sugarcraft.
Yeah, no time for sugarcraft or fun. I mean, fun in that sense with the larger family. You're stuck with your aviation family. So in the year 2012, the airline that I was working with had gone through a financial downturn. And, we would go to the office and it was really morose. So I was thinking, how do I cheer people up? And because I had a lot of time on my hands, I said, let me start with cupcakes.
They do generally solve everything. I just have to interrupt. I mean, they make everything better.
Yeah, they do. And I remember every week for several months, I baked cupcakes. And for me, it was not just the baking. I get a lot of joy with the decorations, so the harder, the better. The more difficult and intricate they are, the better, because I like a challenge. And so from the cupcakes, people then said, do you think you can bake a birthday cake for my child? And, we have our anniversary. And I would say, okay. And then because I had a lot of time on my hands at that point. So I would go through YouTube and look at other people's creations and then try to replicate, or they would give me a design.